A lot of people often ask me when they're watching my Let's Plays, how were you able to declare a war without using favors to call someone in? The reason for this is because I don't use the cost expansion when I play my Let's Plays, and when I play the game in general, and there's a number of reasons that they do this. The primary reason, however, is due to a feature called diplomatic feedback that was introduced in the cost expansion that I don't particularly enjoy and don't necessarily think is good for the game either. While good in theory, I think it significantly hampers gameplay and reduces options for clever gameplay and finesse, such as what I used in this current Byzantium game in order to get to the level that I currently am at. I think it makes the game harder by imposing arbitrary restrictions rather than making the game more clever and difficult to defeat. By imposing arbitrary restrictions on what one can do with an alliance, and in my opinion, it goes against historical alliances and how they worked as well. As I've said, diplomatic feedback was added in the Caustics expansion. The number of things that it does is plentiful. In addition to adding the estates system, it adds in the diplomatic feedback system. It changes the trust system in the base game of EU4 to a more tangible one with an actual number that you can see, instead of an invisible system based more on a tooltip that it shows when you mouse over relations. This does a number of things. The game also adds in a system of favors that can be used primarily to call people into wars. And you get said favors by answering calls to arms or just being allies with someone for a long time. And the number of favors that you get is also dependent on the size of your country versus the size of the country in question that you want to call into war. If you're a smaller nation, you get favors more slowly than someone who's powerful, such as where I currently am in my Byzantium game, for example. Whereas at the start of the campaign, it would be much slower to get said favors. The other primary benefit of and this in my opinion is one of the best things about diplomatic feedback, if not the best feature, is that it adds in the ability to set your attitude towards other nations. So you can set yourself to neutral, friendly, and threatened and hostile, all of which are useful because it can tell the AI what you need to do. For example, if you're playing as Byzantium, you can set yourself as threatened to the Ottomans, and this will make an alliance with Poland and Austria more likely. However, that's basically where it stops. As it stands in game, diplomatic feedback, mostly what it does, as far as I can tell from what I've seen, is that it gives an arbitrary resource to the diplomacy that must be spent in order to get allies to join offensive wars. And this hurts the game in a number of ways. First of all, smaller nations have an extremely hard time getting their nation off the ground. The small starts are slowed down arbitrarily, in my opinion, across the board, just because getting an alliance with even a medium-sized nation is much more difficult, and it can be very difficult to get them to fight offensive wars with you. And this is especially painful for nations such as Byzantium, where the only place that they can really expand is by expanding into Byzantium, or expanding into the Ottomans. And this is difficult when you can still get alliances with Austria and Poland, thanks to the threatened attitude that you can set towards the Ottomans. But this makes it difficult to get them to actually come fight the Ottomans. And a lot of people can probably say that, it's better that way, it makes more sense, because why would they help out a small nation? But at the same time, if you think about it, there are a couple of examples where this makes a lot of sense historically, and I'll talk about those more later, and why I don't think that this really makes sense in the game, even though it seems to make sense on paper. But as a result of this, the political landscape is a lot less dynamic. For example, you can see in this game that Ryazan, Georgia, Nogai, Shirvan, Hormuz, Mogadishu, a lot of nations exist in this current landscape because they were able to get good alliances with larger nations and use those in order to expand. And I think that this is an important feature of not having diplomatic feedback, of the first system that existed in the base game, is that you can be clever and use political finesse to get alliances with nations that maybe otherwise wouldn't ally you, or that would just be useful in general. And with diplomatic feedback, it's much more difficult to do it. And I have evidence of this, as one of my viewers recently sent me he sent me some screen caps of his Byzantium game where he was playing with all the expansions. And rather than this very colorful Europe that we currently see right now, where Sligo still apparently exists, and you know, where we have Hormuz and Wallachia and the Teutonic Order and Livonian Order. Pretty much all of this was owned, like this was Sweden, this was Russia, this was the Polish Commonwealth, this was France, and this was Austria, and this was Spain. And he was basically just the Ottomans as Byzantium. And it was just a very, very boring looking Europe by this date, basically, that we're currently at. I think he was 5 years ahead of me. And so, with diplomatic feedback, I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, you know, that it causes the big nations to just be unstoppable. Whereas before, if you were a smaller nation, you could play the political landscape and, you know, change the tide of history, basically. And I very much like that a lot more than, well, I don't have an arbitrary number of favors, so even though France is engaged in this war that if I were able to call in my alliance, we could beat him with, that's just not going to happen because I don't have X number of favors because I'm a small nation. And that really irks me about the system, I guess. I don't really appreciate diplomatic feedback in a historical context either, because I think a lot of nations historically jump to the aid of smaller nations out of strategic interest or misplaced alliances historically. If you think of World War I, for example, Russia came to the aid of Serbia, even though Serbia was much smaller, and there wasn't really much of a strategic interest in an alliance between Serbia and Russia. All the same, it still basically caused one of the largest conflicts that the world had ever seen. A similar thing can be seen in the 30 Years' War, where Sweden came to the aid of Saxony against the Austrian Emperor. And then later on, France jumped into the war, even though there was no strategic interest other than weakening the rival, of their country, for example. And this is why the old system makes sense to me. Because if you play as Byzantium, and you ally Austria and the Polish Commonwealth, then they'll want to help you fight the Ottomans, and they'll accept an offensive call to arms because they want to weaken their rival. They want to weaken the person who threatens their position the most, even though they don't really get much out of it in terms of actual land and money. And so that makes much, much more sense to me than, well, I have to wait 20 years to get X number of a resource, rather than, well, we're both available, so yeah, we'll jump on a war with the Ottomans right now since you're calling it. And so I think that historically, like, the diplomatic feedback system doesn't really make that much sense either. And so those two are like the main reasons that I don't play with diplomatic feedback on, and why I don't play with the Cossacks in general. In fact, I don't even own the Cossacks because I didn't find any of the features in it to be really all that interesting or all that great, especially after watching other people use them and seeing the results of other people playing with the Cossacks on. And the Cossacks is also where feature creep really started to become a problem in EU4. When El Dorado came out, it added in some features that were nice. Like, for example, you can make with El Dorado, you can make a custom nation. It adds in some fun mechanics for the Central and South American nations. But for the most part, the game was already fine. The game was done with common sense for the most part, with the exception of the tech system. And with some of the features added in Rights of Man. However, with the Cossacks, we got some feature creep. We got a little bit of feature creep. Let me define it as the systematic implementation of more features than a game actually needs, to the point where it slows down a game that would otherwise be much more fluid and streamlined. For example, not simplified by any stretch of the imagination, but streamlined. For example, one thing people ask me a lot about is, why don't I roll generals from the aristocrats in my country? Well, first of all, I don't have estates because I don't run the Cossacks. And estates are another great example of feature creep. Because I don't think that they're necessary in the game. People say, oh, you can get a free general at this. I'm like, why does that need to be in the game? Why would having an why would pulling a general from the aristocracy be better than one that you actually educated from like a formal academy, for example? I just don't see the purpose in something like that, comparatively. And it adds a lot of busy work to the game where you're constantly trying to assign provinces to different people. And so you're constantly sitting there thinking, like, what can I do with my country? What can I do with this? How can I min-max this? Whereas, like, in this game, I've gotten to a much further point on a per episode basis just by, playing the game and not having to worry about all that micromanagement when it's something that doesn't even necessarily need to be in the game, in my opinion. And the same goes for diplomatic feedback. It adds complexity to a system that was already fairly complex and didn't really need something else added to it to make it more difficult to understand for the most part. If I'm allied to two people and they're my allies and it's not just a defensive, or a guarantee of independence, for example, why wouldn't they join me in an offensive war if they've agreed to this? It's a mutual agreement. If I call them to arms, I expect them to answer. If they call me to arms, I am expected to answer. And if I don't, I take a prestige hit and now a diplomatic reputation hit for dishonoring a call to arms. It also damages my trust with that nation, making it nearly impossible to get an alliance in the future, especially if I'm not a nation that's much larger than them. And so it already made sense, and it was already fairly complex with the way that it works, in terms of like the political webs that you can get into with alliances in this game, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. But with the diplomatic feedback system, it just adds a lot more complexity and busy work. Having to manually set your attitudes towards other people, while useful, can still be rather tedious, I find. And so maybe I'm just complaining too much, but I also think that it's just too much work to do in a system that already makes perfect sense as it is. And obviously there are going to be people in the comments who have exceptions to that sensibility, and that's fine. If you disagree, feel free to in the comments, or if you share a similar opinion, please feel free to comment on that. That's what the channel is here for. We're all about open discourse here on the Darkfire channel. So that's my opinion on the feature creep, and later on I'm going to make another video about the upcoming features that they plan on adding in the next expansion, involving eras, and I think that diplomatic feedback is symptomatic of the larger problem of feature creep that is happening to EU4 over time. And I'm actually going to make this into a series where I talk about various mechanics that I think were just too much. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't know if maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. Either way, be sure to leave a comment, and if you appreciated the discourse, please leave me a like or a dislike if you disagreed with me, for example. And Godspeed, and I'll see you on the next one.